Now we'll talk a bit about non-conscious brain activity, because that also gives us a reason to believe that what happens in the mind is a causal process, because we have learned through neuroscience that very much of what we usually do consciously is something that the brain can also do non-consciously. So here are some examples. For instance, many people who are used to driving have experienced that they can drive on autopilot, that they can be listening to radio or talking to someone sitting next to them or something, and for a long period of time drive without paying conscious attention to what's happening. So after a while you can have driven for a long time and not have thought of anything that happened in traffic, and still you have obviously been placing the car directly or correctly in the lane, adjusting speed, etc., registering lights and traffic signs and all sorts of quite advanced things that you've been doing, but which the brain has been doing then without you being consciously aware of it. Some people have conditions called blind sight or deaf hearing, which means, for instance, in the case of blind sight, people will have eyes that function and their brain functions, but the part of the brain that turns our visual impressions into conscious images is broken. So if you ask them what do you see, they'll say, I see nothing, all's black. But if you throw a ball at them, they'll catch it. Or if you tell them to start walking and there's a labyrinth in front of them, they can walk through the labyrinth without smashing into anything, because their brain is registering what's outside, and still they will say they have no conscious experience of seeing it. Same with deaf hearing then, that people say I hear nothing, but if you tap on the window behind them, they'll turn around and look, etc. So the ears work, but it's just a part of the brain that turns what they hear into a conscious hearing, which is destroyed. Priming is a well-studied phenomenon that you can show something to people so briefly, so quickly, that they will say that they haven't seen it consciously, and still you can influence them. For instance, when they ask questions afterwards, it's obvious that they must have seen it, although it wasn't conscious. And people have maybe experienced themselves, if you're in a party, a lot of groups talking, etc., but suddenly you hear your name in another conversation, and you get consciously aware of that conversation, of what happens there. So the brain is registering, but it reaches your conscious attention when you hear your name. Another example is showing pictures of nude women to men so briefly that they will say they haven't seen anything, and still you can measure what happens in their body, which is the same as what would have happened if they've seen it for a longer time consciously, showing then that the brain has registered what was shown. So these examples were on sensing, but there's also examples on thinking. So in an experiment by Damasio and others, which was a card experiment where people were giving a task, and so it's kind of a quiz or puzzle where you had to draw a card from either one or another pile of cards, and if you understood the system, you would start drawing the correct card or from the correct pile every time, but you had to understand the system before you could do that. And when people were given this task, they also measured how they were sweating, and the skin conductance, and what they realized was that after a while people would start sweating before they were drawing a card from the wrong pile, but they were not sweating every time they drew, even before they were drawing a card from the correct pile. So the only explanation they could find for this was that non-consciously the brain had now solved the puzzle, and so it got stressed and started sweating every time they would draw the wrong card, but not when they draw the right card. And then after a while the persons also were consciously they solved it, and then they would draw the correct cards. But it was an example of quite advanced thinking then in the brain. And I'm used to myself from doing crosswords that when I can't solve anymore, I'll put it aside and not think about it consciously in the meantime. But when I pick it up, I can always fill out a lot of words instantly, because obviously my brain must have been testing various examples and thinking of words that could fit. So it has been non-consciously thinking about the crossword, even if I was not consciously thinking about it. Split brain experiments is a kind of experiment where you have peer persons who have quite severe cases of epilepsy, and then they cut the connection between the two brain hemispheres, which is called corpus callosum in Latin, and then the two halves of the brain, they won't know what the other half is doing. So then you can, if you give information just to one eye, then half of your brain will have this information, but the other half will not. So then they can, for instance, show people one message to one eye: go and pick up a Coke, and they will stand up and go get a Coke, and then they ask the other hemisphere where the language center is, why did you do that? And they don't know, so they just give some interpretation. Well, I felt thirsty, I wanted a Coke. Or they show something funny to one eye, and the person starts laughing, and they say, why are you laughing? And I say, well, I thought your tie looked quite funny. Or because the other half, they don't know, but they'll just give what they think is the reason. Or they can show a spoon to one eye, and they say, what did you see? And I say, and the other half says, I saw nothing. And then say, well, try to pick out the correct object with your hand, and then they will pick up the spoon, because the other half will control the hand picking up the spoon. So this demonstrates that there can be quite some independent activity going on in the brain, which is not conscious. So actually, most of our mind activity is non-conscious, because in consciousness it happens as a serial process with quite limited capacity. So if I ask you to sing the national anthem while adding 149 plus 264, it will probably be too much for your conscious capacity. Whereas when the brain works non-consciously, it can do a lot of things in parallel. So a lot of things happen all the time. We register, remember, get memories, but it happen. Very few of the things come all the way up to the conscious level. So suddenly you might feel happy or depressed or something without knowing why, or you get this, suddenly you start singing this song or having some memories and you don't really understand why, but it's because so much is happening non-consciously in your brain. So just one example for myself. Previous week I was driving and I didn't have the timer in the display, so I was thinking, I wonder what time it is, and my first thought was, well, maybe it's 1927. And I thought, why would I think that? Why would I guess such a specific time? And I looked around and I noticed the car in front of me. The license plate started with 1927. So probably then my brain had non-consciously registered that number, and when I thought of another number, that was the first number that popped into my mind. So with these examples, then we can have some terminology, because it can be. We can ask: should we use terms like see and think if it's non-conscious? Can we say that the brain sees? The brain doesn't have eyes, or that the brain thinks, or is it just a person who can see and think, etc.? On the one hand, you can say, well, the brain doesn't have eyes, so the brain can't see. But on the other hand, it's if the person has no conscious seeing of anything, who is seeing them? It's tempting to say that the brain can see and think, etc., when it's so similar to the conscious seeing. But I think we should just be precise and say, now I'm talking about consciously seeing something, or now it's non-consciously seeing something. And then we can have this terminology and distinguish between brain activity that can never become conscious. So there's a lot of brain activity controlling a lot of things in the body, etc., that can never be conscious. For instance, in the cerebellum, none of the activity becomes conscious. But then you have some brain activity which can become conscious, and which sometimes is conscious and sometimes is not conscious. So that's the way of just talking more specifically and detailed about different kinds of mind activity, as brain activity that can't become conscious, or conscious or non-conscious mind activity. So that's the final example in these videos then on various empirical findings, etc., and supporting this view then that we can have this causal process in the brain, which happens in exactly the same way as it does when we do it consciously, and then supporting then that what happens in the mind in general is a causal process.